Thanks so much for the organizers for inviting me. I'm here to talk about some new research on macroeconomic shocks and how they affect retirement decisions of older workers. So there's not a huge literature on the effect of macroeconomic conditions on older workers, and I think half the co-authors are here of that work. But it generally indicates that retirements rise in recessions. Particularly, most of this work was looking at the Great Recession and how it affected, particularly baby boomers' retirement decisions. This question has become interesting again during the pandemic. As many of you are aware, the labor force participation of older workers fell off a cliff during the pandemic, and it really has not recovered. All of the recovery in employment has been for younger workers. And one of the questions is, are these older workers coming back into the labor market? And if not, it has implications obviously for the retirement security of these baby boomers who may have intended to work longer, and also labor market tightness in the pandemic recovery. So the goal of this paper is partly to introduce a new source of data for studying retirement transitions that I don't believe has ever been used before to look at retirement, and then also to look at the effect of macroeconomic conditions on retirement decisions and also unretirement decisions. I'm going to look at both flows into retirement and flows out of retirement back into the labor market, and an initial look at retirements during the pandemic. Just to highlight what I find, I also find evidence that in that LEHD data that retirements rise in recessions. Unretirements are also cyclical, but less so than retirements. There's not as much cyclical sensitivity. And the LEHD data does suggest a very large retirement wave in the COVID pandemic. So a little bit about the data that I'm using, which many of you are probably unfamiliar with. The LEHD data is an administrative data set at the Census Bureau that covers over 95% of US employment. The data comes from employers that report earnings records to state governments to administer unemployment insurance programs, and they share that data with the Census Bureau for statistical purposes. The LHD data actually has a number of advantages for looking at retirement decisions. It's a very complete coverage of the older workforce. It's longitudinal. It's pretty high frequency, quarterly frequency, and something that's probably key, it's generally more accessible to researchers than particularly Social Security administrative data, which can be difficult to get your hands on, but is similar in many respects. So because the LHD data has not really been used to study retirements, part of the goal of this paper is to establish a methodology for using the data to look at retirement transitions. So I'm going to follow an approach used in the Gordachenko paper using Social Security administrative data and modify it for the LEHD data in two main ways. So I'm going to use, their approach uses large changes in earnings to identify retirement transitions, and I'm going to take the essence of that approach. So I bin older workers into three categories. Full-time workers are workers who are making at least 50% of their peak earnings in their late 40s and early 50s. This is an attached worker sample, I should say, workers who worked at least 7 years out of 10 in their late career. Partial retirement is if you enter you enter partial retirement in the first quarter of a 3-quarter spell where your earnings are less than half of what your peak career earnings were, and you're flagged as entering retirement in the first quarter of a 3-quarter spell where your earnings fall below $1,200, which is like a part-time minimum wage job. Unlike the Gordachenko paper, I'm going to allow people to flow into retirement and also out of retirement. Retirement's not going to be an absorbing state because I am interested in these unretirement flows, especially coming out of the pandemic. So the first question is, using this methodology, are we getting retirement flows that look sensible and resemble other papers. So this panel here on the left is basically just a chart of retirement transitions by age in the LEHD data. And you can see they have two big peaks at 62 and age 65. And that's similar to other studies looking at retirement flows. So flows into partial retirement are the dominant flow until the early Social Security benefit year of 62. And then after that, it's transitions into full retirement that dominate. And the panel on the right here is looking at static flows. These are workers that are in the same state from quarter to quarter. And here you can see that from the mid-50s to this early 70s, this real smooth transition of the workforce from full-time work and into retirement. And at age 62, more than half of these attached workers, who are largely baby boomer workers, a very large baby boomer cohort, have left full-time work. So one puzzle from that previous graph is, even though partial retirement is really commonly part of the transition to retirement, there's very little of the workforce, the older workforce, that's in a partial retirement spell from one quarter to another. And so I investigated, like, what do these retirement spells actually look like? And the answer to that puzzle is that even though entering a partial sort of bridge retirement job is exceedingly common, those jobs tend to be transitory. So in the blue circle here, the average length of a partial retirement spell is just a little over a year. And the overwhelming majority, over 65% of those spells end in a permanent retirement spell. So partial retirement is very transitory, but retirement is very sticky. So even though I'm only requiring 3/4 of almost zero earnings to enter retirement, 70% of older workers who enter such a spell are never seen to work again in the data. So those retirement spells are very sticky. Just under a quarter of retired workers return to some type of work and enter a partial retirement spell. Going back to full-time work after a 3/4 spell of non-employment is really rare. It's only 6% of workers. So the takeaway from those few graphs and tables is that the LHD data using this methodology does actually produce pretty sensible patterns of retirement. So I'm going to now turn to the macroeconomic effects of these, the effect of macroeconomic conditions on these transitions. The panel here on the left is just looking for visual evidence that there is any cyclicality. So it looks at retirement transitions by age from full-time work into retirement and graphs them over time. This is for workers age 55, in the black, age 60, and then age 62. And you can see even just in the time series, some evidence here that transitions into retirement are ticking up in recessions. They did it in the dot-com bust, the Great Recession, and you can see this very large uptick in the COVID pandemic. Unretirements, particularly flows from retirement back into partial retirement, are somewhat cyclical. You can see them dip down. Returning to full-time work from retirement is pretty rare, and it's acyclical. So I'm going to more formally estimate through some descriptive regressions the effect of macroeconomic conditions on these flows with this simple regression, where the left-hand side variable is just the transition rate, or whether a worker experienced a transition from state X to state Y, regressed on a cyclical indicator, worker characteristics, and some seasonal and time trend effects. The cyclical indicator I'm going to use is going to be the change in the unemployment rate, particularly for flows into retirement. They really seem to be driven by that initial contraction. There's not much recovery. And so that actually is the cyclical indicator that's giving me the most power. I'll go through this really quickly in the interest of time. These show flows into retirement. Column 2 basically says that for a 55-year-old worker, about 1% of them flow into retirement per quarter, and that increases with age and also with changes in the unemployment rate. And intuitively, basically a 1 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate increases your probability of retirement about the same amount as aging an additional year. So it's a significant, it's not a huge effect, but it is economically significant. And the column 8 here is looking at flows into partial retirement, and the story there is very similar. They're more frequent flows, so the coefficients are higher, but the story is more or less the same. Unretirement flows, however, are not very cyclically sensitive. So if you look at these coefficients on the change in the UI rate in all circled columns, you can see that the coefficients have fallen a lot. They're statistically significant. It is administrative data, so there's a lot of power here, but these are really small effects. What's really driving unretirements are age. Workers who are younger when they enter retirement are much more likely to unretire, and income. Higher income workers are much more likely to return. So just to quickly sum up, the LEHD data does provide some additional evidence that retirements rise in contractions, and they particularly rose in the Great Recession. Using the coefficients that I just showed you, could estimate that about an excess 5%, the retirement rate of workers increased in excess 5 percentage points during the pandemic, which is a very large effect. And the unretirements are not very cyclically sensitive. So whether or not these older workers are retiring, the recovery may not drive that as much as the fundamentals of who actually left the labor market during the pandemic. And that's it. Thank you very much.